So I recently posted a video talking about the wall in front of the Bible, trying to explain why it sets my teeth on edge to hear so many popular Christian pastors and teachers talk about the Bible in ways that ignore the context. I thought today we'd look at an example. First, some background. I started listening to Patrick Miller and Keith Simon on the podcast Truth Over Tribe years ago now, and while I disagreed at times, they generally seemed to be trying to be thoughtful and nuanced. That podcast ended, or maybe was just rebranded as the new podcast Not Just Sunday. I've missed quite a few episodes, but when I listened to one of the more recent ones titled Why Aren't People Having Kids Anymore?, I had to wonder if they changed the name so they could go ahead and just be more tribal, considering how they seem to go out of their way to signal what tribe they belong to. And I'll get to that in a minute. Much of this episode is their reaction to a clip from The View, which is reacting to another clip. The podcast is nearly an hour long, and there are a lot of things I could react to in it, but I don't want to be just a reaction to a reaction to a reaction to a reaction with each getting longer, so I'm trying to summarize and condense and pick out what I think is most problematic in their reaction. I might put up quotes from the transcript as they are relevant. So, to start, The View was reacting to a quote from Isabella Brown.
If you're not encouraging your children to grow up and have the courage to get married and have kids, more kids than they can afford before they think they're ready, it is high time to start. It is these choices, like deleting our dating apps and quitting birth control pills and saying I do at the altar, that ultimately trickle down into the political policies that we will see save our country.
So Keith and Simon listened to that and agreed that it shouldn't be controversial to encourage people to have kids, which is arguably not quite what she said, but okay. Then they listened to The View's reaction, and I'll put a link to a fuller reaction from The View in the description in case you're curious.
And I think it's just really reckless to be suggesting that people should have children when you now know in this country there's this affordability crisis. So she's advocating for people to be born into poverty, people not being able to feed those children, people not being able to educate those children, and people not being able...
And I have to stop, because each time I watch this clip, I cringe a little bit more. Because as this woman is talking about people not being able to feed their children, these podcasters look like they're about to laugh. I don't want to judge too much based on facial expressions, but their low opinion of her and of what she says is borne out by the things they say later.
What it ends up doing is communicating that the only people who can responsibly have children are people who work for The View. Like people who sent their kids to Ivy League schools, who live on the coast, who make boatloads of money. Like that's who should be having a family, which I find profoundly offensive.
Their facial expressions are just their first signal that they are not in the same tribe as The View. Their laughing reaction to her concern also tells me that they have never been in a situation where they had to rely on SNAP benefits or food banks. They have never had to ration how much food they ate in a day or put their kids to bed hungry. They claim the women of The View are out of touch, but never actually address the problems of food and housing insecurities that are brought up. Perhaps they are equally out of touch? But I don't want to just respond to this clip, but to the whole podcast, and this clip cuts out some significant portions. On the podcast, one of the first things they react to is this.
And for a two-person household, a married household, you need over $400,000 for childcare.
$400,000 over the lifetime of the child, or what?
No.
A year?
It's
That's
a
like a
year.
minute
It's an
almost.
annual income exceeding $400,000 to afford childcare all over the country, according to Lending Tree analysis.
Admittedly, this does sound like an outrageous number. But rather than looking up the source she cites, these two men just imply that all these women are rich East Coast elites out of touch with actual childcare costs. But the source of the number is not hard to find, and it's not out of touch. The study quoted says, for childcare to be considered affordable, it should not exceed 7% of the family's income. Second, the average annual cost of childcare for an infant and a 4-year-old is over $28,000 across the U.S. From there, it is simple math to conclude that a family with 2 kids needing childcare would need to make over $400,000 for that childcare to be considered affordable. Now, we can quibble over that as a definition of affordable. Obviously, it is not saying that people making less than $400,000 per year can't afford childcare. People who make less still pay for childcare, but not without sacrificing other important things. Of course, looking at the data behind her statement is not as humorous as making fun of her for being rich and elite and out of touch, and doesn't signal as well what tribe we belong to, and thus the need to rebrand the podcast. But my main concern on this channel is not necessarily social policy, but how the Bible is understood and used. And these 2 pastors on this podcast want Jesus to be a part of everyday life, not just Sunday. So ostensibly, they want to look at this question of if or when to have children and consider Jesus's perspective. I would guess that they would claim their advice is biblical. And this is what I really want to talk about today, because I think their advice here fails to meet that bar. First off, it's worth noting that they spent a significant portion of this episode talking about their own lives, how good it was for them to marry young and have kids. And this is a common fallacy that pastors especially seem prone to. If it worked well for them, it should work well for you, or at least it should work well for most normal people. Look, guys, I'm happy it worked out well for you. It definitely doesn't work out that well for everyone. If you're not going to examine wider data on how these lifestyle choices affect the broader population, maybe refrain from giving everyone advice based on your own life. Just because something aligns with your experience does not mean it's biblical. Just because something works for you doesn't mean there's enough data to consider it normative or good for everyone. Their experience is valid and can even be helpful, but it should not constitute general advice. For good advice, I would expect them to have data, statistics, and analysis to tell us what has worked best for most people. And if they don't have data, then I would at least expect them to have good arguments from the Bible, considering the premise of the podcast. Spoiler, they don't have either. They did try to talk about the Bible a little. They referenced 2 passages, Genesis 1 and Psalm 127. And I want to talk about their treatment of those passages. But first I need to point out that it is shocking that they reference no passages from the New Testament. They allude to a couple, but don't include references or direct quotes. Aside from the introduction and the conclusion, they only mention Jesus once, and that's to admit that Jesus was a single man who didn't have children. Ironically, as they conclude, they talk about how important it is to talk about Jesus with our children. Not important enough to consider his perspective on the family, apparently. I am concerned that by quoting the passages they do and ignoring what they do, they are making their position clear. They are not looking for nuance or differing opinions here. They have made up their mind and have chosen their tribe. There's no need to look to the New Testament when the family structure in the Old Testament fits with their experience. So their treatment of the Bible is already problematic in claiming to be Christian, but ignoring the teachings of Christ. But let's look at how they treat the 2 passages they do quote. So First, they do quote this verse without context. Maybe they assume that most people are familiar enough with this passage not to need it, but I think more problematic is their assumption that this command to the first humans applies equally to all humans throughout time. Now, they do acknowledge you don't have to reproduce to fulfill your calling as a human, and that's where they reference Jesus. If Jesus was single, I guess you can be too, but probably shouldn't be. Their understanding seems to be God told the first humans to have babies. Therefore, almost all humans should have babies, making the declining birth rate a moral issue. This pretty blatantly ignores any relevant cultural context. So let's question that a bit. First off, are we certain that be fruitful and multiply means only have babies? The language here seems to be quite poetic. Are we missing anything by flattening it to merely the command to reproduce? Second, do we know that God meant for this command to apply to all humans for all of time? Can we make a case for that, or are we just assuming? Third, the earth is arguably pretty full. Do we need to keep filling it? Is there anything in the language that indicates this is meant to be an ongoing command, or is it something that can be completed? And fourth, descendants are hugely emphasized throughout the Old Testament, both culturally and covenantally. Is it possible that this pattern is changed by Jesus in the New Covenant? The second passage from Psalm 127 has similar issues. They reference the idea that children are a blessing several times, but only once quote the actual passage where they seem to have gotten it, and I see a few issues. First, maybe it's a translation difference, but children are a blessing is not actually in there. The version I just put up, the NIV, says children are a heritage and a reward, but is that the same thing as saying they are a blessing? The next verse says a man is blessed by many children, but are women also blessed? Seems like this is worth examining if we are telling women to have more children. Third, this is a psalm. We should take that genre into account. It's definitely not a command saying, always remember, children are a blessing. And fourth, again, I think the Abrahamic covenant adds some needed context to this passage. Children are a blessing at least partly because they are a constant fulfillment of the promise that God made to Abraham that he would have numerous descendants. And I think this last point is really where I want to camp out for a minute. The covenants with Abraham and David are all family-centric. They are descendant-based. Likely, this was largely because of how society functioned then. The family was the main unit of society, and the family only survived if there were descendants. So there is a huge shift in the New Testament when suddenly the covenantal community is open to all, including Gentiles. It is no longer a matter of descent. The goal shifts from having children to making disciples. Both Jesus and Paul de-emphasize marriage and children in different ways. So maybe we can allow that marriage and children do not need to be the focus of the Christian life, and family doesn't need to be biological to count. And they even recognize this. They don't quote any specific passages, but they say Jesus undermines our loyalty to family. But it doesn't matter. Patrick and Keith are determined that the family-centric pattern we see in the Old Testament is what we should be emulating today, despite all evidence to the contrary. And there are a couple times where they seem so close to seeing the point and then totally miss it. At one point, one of them even says,
this idea of having children and being fruitful and multiplying and children being a blessing, aspects of how they viewed childhood were countercultural in the ancient world. But in many ways, this was not countercultural to a Jewish person in their culture. This was written to people who in their culture would have said, yeah, I want to have more kids. Kids are a blessing. And for them, it was a life or death blessing because having more children meant having hands on the farm. I think that's what's so challenging about this is that the Bible is challenging us in a way that maybe even its original authors never quite expected a culture would come along that would be so antagonistic towards children.
And I don't even know what to say to that. You're so close. You recognize that this was written to a different people in a different culture with different goals and needs. You recognize that you may be understanding this in a way the original author didn't intend, but of course it applies to us in exactly the same way without question or modification in spite of our different culture and circumstances. And look, maybe it does. I think some things apply pretty similarly across cultures. For example, one of the most often repeated commands in the New Testament is to love one another. And while that might be lived out differently in our culture than in the author's culture, I don't think it takes a lot of knowledge of their context to have a pretty clear understanding of the command. But Genesis 1 and Psalm 127 are not a simple, often repeated command. So if podcasters want to claim that they apply to us in our time and culture the same way they applied when they were written, they can, first off, examine the context in which these passages were written and seek to understand how they fit into that context and how people in that context would have applied them. Then, because Christians believe that Christ made a new covenant, they need to look at how these Old Testament passages were used or referenced in the New Testament to see if there was a shift in understanding or application that we should take into account. And finally, if they're certain they understand the cultural and linguistic context of these passages, they can start to ask how they might apply to us today with our very different circumstances. And with all that work, they may be able to feasibly conclude that the application hasn't changed over time. Or, two, they can just assume, without evidence, that God wrote the Bible to apply to us today in exactly the same way as we think it applied when it was first written. And the podcasters, they take the second option. They assume, without argument, that even though these were written to and about ancient Israelites, apparently God made sure to put "children are a blessing" in here to speak to modern-day Americans about what they should value. They are ignoring context to come to a conclusion that fits with their lived experience, and it's reckless. I'm not necessarily arguing against the belief that God can divinely allow for the Bible to mean different things to different people at different times, but if that is their argument here, they should state it clearly, and it should not stop them from considering the original context of the passage and the broader context of the Bible. Instead, they take the simple English reading and declare, "This is the Word of God for us today." And this is an example of people ignoring the wall and coming away with problematic applications. And it would be one thing if they were saying, hey, I think it's a good idea for most people to get married and have kids. But they're not just offering their opinion. They are claiming this is God's design. And that is heavy. They are saying if you don't want children, you are going against God's design. If you are worried about being able to afford kids, you are valuing money too much. Either way, you are probably sinning. And the passages they quote are not meant to hold that weight. I think there is very little chance of what I say reaching Patrick or Keith or even any of the people who follow them. But if it does, here's what I would say. First, do better with how you use the Bible, because how you used it on this podcast was reckless. If you truly want people to be better Christians, maybe put more emphasis on the teachings of Christ. And second, do better listening. Actually address the data and issues brought up on The View instead of mocking them. Listen to what people are saying about why they aren't getting married or having kids. As I've been working through my thoughts on this topic, I've also been reading For the Love of Women by Dorothy Little Greco. If you want to truly examine and address the reasons why especially Gen Z women are not wanting to get married or have children, this book would be a great place to start. Your personal experience is limiting your knowledge, and just telling people to get married and have kids like you did will not solve the societal pressures pushing them away from that. I'm going to conclude here. And if I've done my job well, hopefully instead of answers, you have more questions about what these passages should mean for us today. Because while I think there are better answers than the ones Patrick and Keith offer, I don't necessarily want to be the one offering all the answers. I want to be the one encouraging you to question your assumptions and dig deeper. If you found this reaction and example of ignoring the wall helpful, please, like, share, subscribe, all the things that will help other people find this too. Or send me another example you'd like me to look at.